What is the Super Bowl hangover? And no, not that type of hangover. I'm talking about this one. The phenomenon when one of, if not both Super Bowl teams struggle the following year. This subject pretty much comes up, at least as a talking point, every single year.
That brings the question, is the Super Bowl hangover real?
The idea of whether or not a Super Bowl hangover is a real thing has been up for debate.
Super Bowl hangover was maybe overstated, but just how real can it be to shake off last year and start moving forward this year?
Some believe it's a legitimate phenomenon, while others call it a complete myth. Well, here are the numbers. Since the merger in 1970, the Super Bowl loser actually has the highest percentage of making the playoffs the following year at 72%, followed closely by the Super Bowl winner at 70%. These percentages are much higher than non-Super Bowl playoff teams and non-playoff teams from the previous year. So clearly, this evidence doesn't support the idea of the Super Bowl hangover. But to bring in another perspective, it's often that the teams with the highest expectations are the two that reached the Super Bowl the previous season, often picked by bettors as teams that will make another deep run. So when these teams fall short of making the playoffs, they will often be considered the most disappointing of that season. So even if the data doesn't suggest teams suffer a so-called Super Bowl hangover very often, it can still be the term we use for those who disappoint us the following season. Now, it's one thing to just miss the playoffs. It's a whole nother thing when you're one of the worst teams in the league, which brings us to the franchise that's at the focal point of this video, the Raiders. Now, before we continue, this video is sponsored by SeatGeek. With over 28 million downloads, SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app. Recently, I was lucky enough to witness an NFL playoff game, which was a total blast. And even though football season is over, there are more than 70,000 events every single day available on SeatGeek, which includes concerts, other sports, festivals, and more. To pass the time till next football season, why not go out and do something fun? Plus, it's so easy to use the SeatGeek app. They put tickets all across the web into one place to make sure you're getting a good deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale from 1 to 10, so look for the green dots. Green means good and red means bad. Every ticket is backed by their buyer guarantee, and SeatGeek is the only site that lets you return your tickets ahead of the event with swaps. And you know I came through for you guys. Use my code KTO for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. Make sure you click the link in the description to download the app. The Raiders are one of the most storied franchises in league history. From 1967 to 1993, 27 seasons, they made the playoffs 18 times, made the AFC Championship 12 times, and won 3 Super Bowls, all while being considered the bad boys of the NFL. But then they hit a rough spot, going their longest stretch in franchise history in the Super Bowl era without making the playoffs, 6 years. Things had begun to turn a corner, however, with their young, fiery head coach, John Gruden.
That's intentional grounding! What's the rule?
After being hired in 1998, the moves made with Gruden at the helm slowly turned this team into a contender. Moves like the team drafting Charles Woodson in 1998, signing veteran quarterback Rich Gannon in free agency, and adding Jerry Rice in 2001. The Raiders reached the AFC title game in 2000, and should have made it again in 2001 if it weren't for the tuck rule.
Quarterback's arm was going forward. It is an incomplete pass.
But regardless of getting screwed, the Raiders were back.
Down into the end zone to Rice.
Highlighted by their veterans. Now, if you thought the NFL scriptwriters were elite today, listen to this. Stunning news drops on February 18th, 2002. The Raiders traded head coach John Gruden to the Tampa Bay Bucks for picks and cash. Less than a year later, the Raiders, under new head coach Bill Callahan, finally got over the hump and reached the Super Bowl. Looks like moving on from their head coach was a good idea, right? Good for them. So, who did they face?
He just wanted to shine his shoes with Callahan and Al Davis. He was going to show them that they made the biggest mistake of their life of letting them out the door.
John Gruden had led his new team all the way to the big game, and he was out for revenge. This was an amazing storyline for fans of the sport. A team who traded away their coach is now playing him in the biggest game of the year. But for the Raiders, considering they made the Super Bowl, this was the worst possible scenario. The man who replaced Gruden in Oakland was Bill Callahan, who had been under Gruden since before the Oakland days. And basically, he kept everything the same as the way Gruden had it before he was traded, from the schemes to the plays and even audible names.
I was going to be Rich Gannon and simulate the Raiders' offense. And when I threw that slant to Carl the Truth Williams right in front of Brian Kelly, I mean, the place went crazy.
It's kind of like a fish story. The longer you get away from it or the more it's told, the greater the story.
It was so apparent that during the Super Bowl, the Bucs defenders admittedly said they knew the plays before they were going to happen.
Sluggo C.
Slant, first down 10. From the 45. Gannon pump fake, looking to his right, throwing to his right. Intercepted.
This led to the Raiders getting completely blown out. There were other major factors that affected this game negatively for the Raiders, including Callahan completely throwing out the game plan for a new one just 2 days before the Super Bowl.
All week long, we talked about pounding the ball, running the ball. All of a sudden that Saturday, we decided that we were going to throw the ball.
This led All-Pro center Barrett Robbins to entering a manic episode and disappearing, showing up right before the game thinking that the team had already won the game. Robbins was so incoherent that Callahan made the decision to not allow him to play. Also, this changing of the game plan was later used as evidence by wide receiver Tim Brown to suggest that Callahan purposely sabotaged the game.
Do you think it had something to do with, like, we're going to try and outsmart Gruden? He thinks we know what we're going to do, but we're going to...
Well, no, because we went back to the offense that Gruden knew. So the audible said with that.
I've covered both the Barrett Robbins story and the Callahan story in other videos, so if you want to know more, I'll leave a link to those videos. For this story though, let's just leave it at the fact that the Raiders were humiliated on Super Bowl Sunday. Also, from this point on, tension between Callahan and the players, also with the front office, began to build.
You hate the Raider organization so much, and the fact that it was your boy across the field, that this was like the perfect opportunity for you to do what you did. So that's how we go into the 03 season.
Entering the following season, the Raiders lost a few key players, but overall, still had most of their roster carry over. In fact, they were tied with having the fourth best odds at winning the Super Bowl, and at the very least, were seen as a playoff team. But things were apparent early. There were problems. In the preseason, Bill Romanowski attacked and injured one of his teammates, Marcus Williams, during a scrimmage. Williams was forced to retire after Romanowski crushed his eye socket from the punch. Williams later sued Romanowski over the incident. As for the play on the field, this was not the same team that reached the Super Bowl. Not even close. Through 6 games, the offense looked lifeless.
He throws incomplete for Brown.
And the defense was horrible.
Look who's wide open.
Rich Gannon went from league MVP to one of the worst starters in the NFL, and this team just looked old and slow, which they were. Gannon was 38. Romanowski was 37. Their best 2 receivers were 41 and 37. Rod Woodson was 38. Their best O-lineman was 32. And their top running back was 31. In other words, this team was never built to last. It was an all-or-nothing attempt at a Super Bowl with no backup plan. And in 2003, it became painfully clear. After the Raiders got off to a 2-5 start, many of the players, including Tim Brown, publicly criticized Callahan, even suggesting that he was trying to sabotage the season. The supporters of Callahan recognized that the team was aging and needed younger talent. To get it, he would have had to cut existing salaries, which was an assertion that did not sit well with many of the team's veterans. Things had gotten to such a bad point that after a bad loss against the Denver Broncos, Callahan said this about his team.
He's got to be the dumbest team in America in terms of playing the game. I apologize for that, but that's the best we can do. That's a sad problem.
To make matters worse, any glimmer of hope was squashed after Rich Gannon suffered a season-ending injury in game number 7. And he wasn't the only player that got hurt. Bill Romanowski also suffered an injury early in the season and never played another NFL snap. After possessing the second best offense and 6th best scoring defense in 2002, both units were close to the bottom in their respective categories. The coaches and players were at each other's throats, and this team finished with a soul-crushing 4-12 record. For every team that has ever reached the Super Bowl, this was the worst following season record of all time. Of course, injuries impacted this, but it wasn't like they were going to win many more games with Gannon at the helm. Following the season, it was the dawn of a new era. Callahan was fired, and in came Norv Turner, who brought an entirely different offensive style that was not suited to the team's talents at the time.
You know, I sat with Jerry Rice a couple of times in the last couple of years, and he told me Norv Turner is the worst head coach
he's ever played for at any level, all the way down to Pee Wee ball.
The team stunk it up once again in 2004. Tim Brown had left in 2003, Rice was traded away during the season, and Rich Gannon suffered a career-ending neck injury. Any echoes of a championship contender were gone. I found this quote from an article back in 2011 by Rich Langford over at silverandblackpride.com. Individual players get old, but it's unusual to see an entire team grow old overnight. Then again, most teams don't open the season with a 38-year-old quarterback, receivers who are 37 and 41, a trio of over 30 running backs, and an assortment of defenders pushing 40. The downturn in performance was dramatic and across the board, with everything from run defense to pass rush to pass protection affected. The Raiders' pass offense, DVOA, declined 51.1 percentage points in 12 months. For a team built around the pass, it was a catastrophe. And with that, the worst period in Raiders history had begun. From this point, it was one bad decision after another. Missing on draft picks like Jamarcus Russell, bad trades that later became successful for other teams like Randy Moss and Carson Palmer.
What should they do with Carson Palmer?
Dump him.
Okay.
Good riddance. See you when you see you.
The quick trigger on firing coaches, giving the organization a complete lack of stability. And for Raiders Nation, this post-Super Bowl era has been like a hangover that never ended. I went and gathered data of the worst victims of the so-called Super Bowl hangover, teams that either won or lost the Super Bowl and did horrible the next season. Teams like the 89 and 98 Broncos, 04 Eagles, the 2015 Panthers, and 2019 Niners were all examples of teams that did horrible after making the Super Bowl, but they bounced back to make the playoffs the following year. Teams that took a little longer include the 86 Giants and the 87 Redskins, which took 3 years to return. Then you have the 98 Falcons, 06 Bears, and even that Bucs team that won the Super Bowl with Gruden, which all took 4 years to return to the playoffs. Then, to top them all, we have the Raiders, which took 14 years to return to the playoffs. And even then, they've only made the playoffs twice since that Super Bowl run, and haven't even won a playoff game since 2003. To make matters even worse, let's go back to John Gruden.
You know anything about Metallica?
Something like that.
Pretty good band, huh?
So first off, it's brutal to lose to your former coach the year after you trade him. Now, it would have been way worse if the Bucs turned into a juggernaut contender year in and out, but they didn't. The rest of the Gruden Bucs years were a disappointment and led to his eventual firing. After stepping away from coaching to be on TV, Gruden made big news when he returned to coaching in 2018, when the Raiders hired him once again. In some sense, he was always a Raider, and felt that there was some unfinished business with the franchise. After signing one of the biggest coaching contracts in the history of the league, Gruden began to slowly revive the team to where, in his second year back, the Raiders started 6-4.
Directing traffic, throwing, intercepted!
But after many crucial injuries, they finished 7-9. Feeling like they were on the cusp of making it back to relevance, big free agency news took place entering the 2020 offseason. Tom Brady was looking for a new team, and it turns out that Brady and his buddy Gronk going to the Raiders was almost a lock.
It was almost a done deal. And at the last minute, Gruden blew the deal up and said that he didn't want him.
So Gruden, now a part of the Raiders, apparently didn't want to bring these guys in. And guess who they signed with? Tampa freaking Bay. And like Gruden in year one with the Bucs, they went out and won the Super Bowl.
Third option, end zone, caught! Gronkowski